We've sort of talked about human population, we've talked about resources, non-renewable and renewable resources, but the next thing I want to talk about is why we care about any of this. Like, why do we care that the environment why do we care about harming the environment, or why do we care about resource depletion? And it's all going to come back to the maintenance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of life. It's going to be described in terms of number of different species and the relative abundance of those species. We are currently in a biodiversity crisis. The number of extinctions expected to occur in the near future is unparalleled in the history of the Earth. The major causes of extinction would be habitat loss. So human occupation and alteration of nearly every biome on Earth. Tropical rainforests and coral reefs are especially concerning because they are particularly rich in varieties of species. Already, tropical rainforests have been reduced from 14% of the global landmass to only 6% of the global landmass. Less than half of our tropical rainforests remain. Over 60% of coral reefs have been destroyed or are on the verge of destruction. Alien species are another cause for the loss of biodiversity. Alien species, sometimes referred to as exotics, are non-native members of an ecosystem. Humans have introduced alien species into ecosystems via colonization, horticulture, agriculture, and accidental transport. So, for example, the Pilgrims brought the dandelion to the United States for food, but now we have widespread dandelions found absolutely everywhere in North America. Invasive species, alien species, crowd out our native species. Pollution, so there are a lot of different forms of pollution. Acid deposition from acid rain is going to weaken trees and increase their susceptibility to diseases and insects. The depletion of the ozone shield is going to limit crops and tree growth and kill plankton that sustain our ocean life. Organic chemicals released into the environment interfere with hormone function and reproduction. Diseases. Domestic animals expose wildlife to their pathogens when humans encroach on wildlife habitats. Wildlife can also be infected by other wild animals that are foreign to their habitats, and the number of pathogens that cause disease is on the rise, threatening the health of both humans and wildlife. Overexploitation, when the number of individuals taken from the wild is so great that it severely reduces the population. A great example of this would be overfishing. Overfishing sets in motion a chain of events that negatively impacts the food web. Not only are we depleting our own resource in the population of the fish, however, we're depleting the food source for all of the higher predators that rely on that fish. We can also imbalance the ecosystem as a whole when we remove the fish that we are fishing. When they are removed from the food web, suddenly their prey is going to bloom in population. We're going to see huge growths of maybe algae blooms, or we're going to see huge influx in population of plankton, phytoplankton, whatever it is that the fish we are fishing are feeding on are going to see huge increases in population when we kill off their predators. So we want to talk about some of the direct and indirect values of biodiversity. Like, why do we care about the maintenance of biodiversity? And there are a lot of really important reasons. But the direct value of biodiversity refers to the direct value of wildlife species, which is going to be related to their medicinal, agricultural, and consumptive use value. Medicinal value. Just as an example, most of the prescription drugs used in the United States were originally derived from living organisms. So, for example, the rosy periwinkle from Madagascar has provided us with useful medicines that have been used to treat leukemia and Hodgkin's disease. Penicillin is derived from a naturally occurring fungus. Certain bacteria produce antibiotics, tetracycline, and streptomycin. We rely heavily on biodiversity to produce medicines for us and pharmaceuticals. Agricultural value, crops such as wheat, corn, and rice are all going to be derived from wild plants that have been modified. When rice crops in Africa were being devastated by a virus, researchers found one that contained a gene for resistance to that virus, which then helped greatly increase those rice crops in Africa. The use of biological pest controls is preferable to the use of chemical pesticides. So when the cotton aphid became resistant to pesticides, farmers introduced natural predators to help reduce those pests that were eating crops. Most flowering plants are going to be pollinated by animals such as bees, wasps, butterflies, beetles, birds, and bats. So it's hugely important that we cultivate and encourage biodiversity in our pollinators because we rely so heavily on them. Unfortunately, modern agriculture often kills wild bees by spraying those fields with pesticides. Pesticides can have a huge negative impact on our bee population. Finally, there's consumptive use value. We don't really practice aquaculture nearly as much as we practice agriculture, but we still do grow fish and shellfish for food. We also harvest wild fish, things like trout and tuna, crustaceans like shrimps and crabs, and mammals like whales are still being hunted and harvested from the wild. Many wild trees are still felled for their wood. However, a forest is going to be worth far more if it's used for fruit and rubber production than timber production. So we rely heavily on the biodiversity of plants and animals for their direct value that they bring to us, that direct monetary value that they bring to us. However, biodiversity also brings a lot of other benefits to us that cannot be directly measured by their financial contribution. So to preserve wildlife, it's much more economical to save ecosystems than to save individual species. Ecosystems perform many indirect services for humans. They are indirect because it's not easy to calculate the dollar amount associated with them. However, they do have a huge impact on us. So number one, waste disposal. Humans dump millions of tons of waste into natural ecosystems each year, but it would soon cover the entire planet without decomposers. We rely heavily on natural decomposers to help break down wastes that are dumped into the environment. Some organisms can break down pollutants like heavy metals and pesticides. Most terrestrial organisms need fresh water, which is going to be supplied by the water cycle. Unlike other commodities, there's really no substitute for fresh water. Desalination of seawater is many times the cost of fresh water acquired via the water cycle. Natural ecosystems exert a sponge effect, meaning that they soak up water and then they release it very slowly, making it readily available whenever we need it. Intact ecosystems naturally prevent soil erosion. So, for example, the Philippines used to export $100 million worth of oysters, mussels, clams, and cockles each year. Now, the silt created from deforestation is carried down rivers, which smothers the mangrove ecosystem that serves as a nursery for those shellfish, and they are not able to export those shellfish anymore. Ecosystems are going to be characterized by energy flow and chemical cycling. Biodiversity contributes to the water, phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, and other biogeochemical cycles. We depend heavily on these cycles for fresh water, phosphate, uptake of natural excess soil nitrogen, and the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Technology simply cannot substitute for any of those biogeochemical cycles. At a local level, trees provide us with shade. In the rainforest, transpiration from trees help maintain area rainfall. Without trees, it would transform into a much more arid ecosystem. Globally, forests help stabilize the climate by taking up carbon dioxide. When trees are destroyed, carbon dioxide is then going to be released into the atmosphere. Finally, ecotourism. Ecotourism is a really interesting indirect value of biodiversity. In the United States, nearly 100 million people vacation in natural settings. They spend $4 billion a year on fees, travel, lodging, and food. Many tourists go sport fishing, whale watching, boat riding, hiking, and bird watching. So we need that biodiversity in order to encourage tourism to areas that rely heavily on it to sustain their economy. So you should be able to describe some of the factors that are contributing to the current extinction crisis, summarize the direct and indirect benefits of preserving wildlife, and discuss the importance of biodiversity to human society.